There's a guy in San Diego who owns a $3 million house outright, zero mortgage. On paper, he's crushing it. Net worth somewhere north of 3.5 million when you add up his 401k and some index funds. But here's what nobody tells you. He can't retire, not even close. Because when you subtract that house from the equation, he's got maybe $400,000 in actual money. He's 62, and he's still working 50-hour weeks because his property taxes alone are 30 grand a year, and you can't pay those with drywall equity. Meanwhile, there's a woman in Austin renting a $1,200 apartment with $850,000 in her Vanguard account. She quit her job at 47. Guess which one is actually a millionaire in the way that matters? Here's what I'm going to show you. The overwhelming majority of people who call themselves millionaires are only hitting that number because of their house. Strip out home equity, and suddenly we're not talking about 7% of Americans. We're talking about 2%. And that difference, that gap between being worth $1 million and having $1 million you can actually use, that's the entire game. That's what separates people who look rich from people who are genuinely financially independent. By the way, I built a free early retirement calculator because most online ones are mathematically wrong. It uses BlackRock and Vanguard logic to expose the weak points in your plan. And I only ask for your email to send the report, so I don't store any of your financial data. Link in the description. Let me tell you about a poker player I know who learned this lesson the hard way. Back in 2007, he was crushing the Vegas circuit, pulling in maybe $200,000 a year. He bought a house in Henderson for 500 grand. Felt like he'd made it. Fast forward to 2009 and the house is worth 320. He's still got 400,000 in his bankroll, still playing, still making money. But mentally, he fell apart. Why? Because on paper, his net worth had dropped by almost 200 grand, and he couldn't stop thinking about it. Every time he sat down at a table, he was playing scared. Here's the thing though. Nothing about his actual financial situation had changed. His liquid assets, the money that actually mattered for his lifestyle and his ability to keep playing, were completely intact. But because we're conditioned to measure success by net worth, which includes all this illiquid garbage, he convinced himself he was broke. That's the psychological trap. We conflate net worth with financial security, but they're not the same thing. Let's establish the framework here. There are two types of millionaires, and only one of them matters. Type 1, net worth millionaires. That's everyone who owns more than they owe, and it adds up to 7 figures. Cars, houses, retirement accounts, that signed baseball card collection, all of it. According to UBS, there are roughly 24 million of these people in the United States. That's about 7% of the total population, or 9% of adults. Sounds impressive until you realize that most of them got there because they bought a house in the right zip code at the right time. Type 2, investable asset millionaires. These are people with $1 million in liquid wealth, money in accounts they can actually access, stocks, bonds, cash, retirement funds. Things you can convert to spending power without selling your primary residence or taking out a loan. That's only about 6 million people in the US, 2.3% of adults. That's the number that matters, because that's the group that could theoretically stop working tomorrow and still cover their bills indefinitely without liquidating their entire life. Now you're probably thinking, okay, but a house is still wealth, right? It still counts. And sure, technically, yes. If you own a $700,000 house outright, that's $700,000 of net worth. But here's the problem. You can't spend it. You can't invest it. You can't live off it unless you sell the house, take out a reverse mortgage, or borrow against it. It's locked up. It's like having a winning lottery ticket. You're not allowed to cash until you move out of your home. And for most people, their home is their single biggest asset, which means the majority of their net worth is trapped in something that doesn't generate income. It only consumes it. Property taxes, insurance, maintenance, utilities. Your house is an expense that happens to appreciate. That's very different from an asset that pays you. There's a story about 2 brothers in Seattle. Both worked in tech during the 90s and early 2000s. One of them, let's call him Eric, bought a house in Capitol Hill in 1998 for $300,000. Paid it off over 20 years, and by 2025, it's worth $1.2 million. The other brother, let's call him Dan, kept renting, never bought property. but he was maxing out his 401k every single year, putting another $15,000 into a taxable brokerage account, just buying index funds, nothing fancy. By 2025, Eric's net worth is $1.4 million, the house plus about $200,000 in retirement accounts. Dan's net worth is $1.1 million, all of it in liquid investments. On paper, Eric looks richer. In reality, Dan retired at 53. Eric is still working because he needs the income to maintain the house and cover his life. His wealth is trapped in a structure he lives in. Dan's wealth is working for him, generating passive income, compounding. That's the difference. Here's where it gets really interesting. When you look at the data on who these investable asset millionaires actually are, you start to notice patterns. They're not flashy. They're not driving new cars. A study from the book The Millionaire Next Door, which came out in the 90s but still holds true, found that the average millionaire drives a car that's several years old, lives in a middle-class neighborhood, and you'd never guess they had money just by looking at them. The people who look rich, the ones with the big house and the least luxury sedan, they're often the ones with the least liquid wealth, because they're spending everything they make, or worse, borrowing against their home equity to fund a lifestyle. They're net worth rich and cash flow poor. The actual millionaires, the ones with liquid assets, they're invisible. They're your neighbor in the modest ranch house who's been driving the same Honda Accord for 12 years. They just quietly put 15% of their income into a Roth IRA and a taxable account every year for 30 years, and now they don't have to work. This is where most financial advice completely misses the point. Everyone's obsessed with net worth because it's the number that sounds impressive at dinner parties. But net worth is a vanity metric if most of it is locked up in your primary residence. What actually matters is how much passive income you can generate and how much liquid wealth you have access to. Let me give you a concrete example. Let's say you're 55 years old. You own an $800,000 house outright, and you've got $300,000 in a 401k. On paper, you're worth $1.1 million. Congratulations, you're a millionaire. But you're not retiring. Why? Because that $300,000, if you follow the 4% rule, gives you $12,000 a year in safe withdrawal income. That's $1,000 a month. You can't live on that. You still need to work. Now, let's say you're also 55, but instead of owning a house, you've been renting a modest apartment for $1,500 a month, and you've got $900,000 in index funds. You're not a net worth millionaire. You're worth $900,000. But that $900,000 at 4% gives you $36,000 a year. That's $3,000 a month. Subtract your $18,000 in rent, and you've still got $18,000 left for everything else. You can actually retire. So who's better off? The person with a higher net worth or the person with the liquid assets? Let me tell you about a neighbor I had in Phoenix. This guy was a retired engineer, owned his house, probably worth $600,000. Nice place. But every time I talked to him, he was stressed about money. Couldn't afford to fix the air conditioning when it broke, was constantly worried about property taxes going up. On paper, he was a millionaire. His house, his retirement accounts, it all added up. But his actual monthly income was maybe $2,500 from Social Security and a small pension. He was living paycheck to paycheck despite having 7 figures in net worth. The problem was that almost all of it was in the house, and he didn't want to move. He was psychologically locked into the idea that owning a home was success, even though it was keeping him financially trapped. That's the brain problem I'm talking about. He had options. He could have sold, downsized, freed up $400,000 in cash, invested it, and doubled his monthly income. But he didn't, because in his mind, selling the house would mean admitting he failed. That's how most people think. They measure success by assets they own, not by the life they can actually afford to live. Now, let's talk about what this means for the FIRE community, the financial independence retire early people. These folks figured this out years ago. They don't care about net worth. They care about 2 things: how much they spend per year and how much passive income they generate. If you spend $40,000 a year and your portfolio generates $50,000 a year, you're done. You can retire. Doesn't matter if you're worth $900,000 or $2 million. The number that matters is the gap between what you need and what your assets produce. And here's the key insight. Every dollar tied up in your primary residence is a dollar that's not producing income. If you've got $1 million house and $200,000 in investments, you're not financially independent. You're house rich and cash poor. But if you've got a $300,000 house and $900,000 in investments, or even better, if you're renting and you've got $1.2 million in investments, you're free. The house is a liability, pretending to be an asset. I want to show you the math on a realistic scenario, because this is where the distinction becomes crystal clear. Let's say you're a couple. Both of you are 50 years old. You live in Denver. You bought a house in 2010 for $400,000. You've been paying it down, and by now you owe maybe $100,000 on the mortgage. The house is worth $850,000 in today's market. You've also been contributing to your 401ks, and between the two of you, you've got $400,000 saved. Your total net worth is $1.15 million. You're millionaires. Feels good. But let's look at the reality. That $400,000 in retirement accounts, using the 4% rule, gives you $16,000 a year in sustainable withdrawal income. That's about $1,300 a month. Your mortgage payment, even though you only owe $100,000, is still probably $800 a month when you factor in property taxes and insurance. So your net monthly income from your investments is $500. You can't retire on that, not even close. You need to keep working for at least another 15 years to build up enough in those retirement accounts to actually live off them. Meanwhile, all that equity in your house is just sitting there, doing nothing for you. It's not generating income. It's appreciating, sure, but you can't spend appreciation unless you sell. You're trapped. Now let's run the same scenario, but with a different strategy. Same couple, same age, same starting point. But instead of buying that house in Denver, they rented. $1,500 a month, which over 15 years is $270,000 in rent payments. Painful, I know. But here's what they did with the money they would have spent on a down payment. Mortgage principal, property taxes, maintenance, all of it. They invested it consistently. They ended up with $1.1 million in their retirement accounts by age 50. Same net worth, roughly, as the homeowners. But now, at 4%, that's $44,000 a year. Subtract their $18,000 in annual rent, and they've got $26,000 left. That's $2,100 a month in free cash flow. They can retire right now. Same net worth. Completely different financial reality. Here's the comedic part. I was at a barbecue last year, and this guy starts telling everyone about how he's a millionaire now. He's maybe 58, super proud. He bought his house in the early 2000s in Orange County, paid $600,000. Now it's worth $1.3 million. He's got maybe $200,000 in his 401k. So yeah, net worth millionaire. Everyone's congratulating him. Then someone asks when he's retiring. He goes quiet and says, oh, probably not for another 7 or 8 years. Still need the income. And I'm standing there thinking, man, you're not a millionaire in any way that actually matters. You're just a guy who got lucky with real estate timing, and now you're locked into working until you're 65 because you can't access any of that wealth. The second comedic cutaway is this. I saw a YouTube comment once that said, I'm technically a millionaire if you count my house, my car, and round up aggressively. That's the level of cope we're dealing with here. People are so desperate to hit that 7-figure psychological milestone that they'll include anything with a resale value just to get there. Your furniture, your watch collection, the equity in your timeshare. It's all net worth, baby. But now you might be thinking, okay, so what about people who own their home and have liquid assets? Isn't that the best of both worlds? And yeah, sure, if you can pull that off, that's ideal. But here's the thing. For most people, the house is the thing that prevents them from building liquid wealth. Because the money that goes into a mortgage payment, into property taxes, into maintenance, that's money that doesn't go into index funds. And over a 30-year period, the compounding difference is massive. Let's say you're paying $2,000 a month in total housing costs for a mortgage. If instead you rented for $1,200 a month and invested the other $800, that's $9,600 a year. Over 30 years, at a 7% average annual return, that's $900,000. That's the opportunity cost of homeownership. Now, to be fair, your home is also appreciating, and you're building equity. But in most markets, the long-term return on residential real estate is like 3 to 4% annually. The stock market averages 10%. The math isn't even close. The psychological shift you have to make here is to stop thinking of your home as an investment and start thinking of it as a lifestyle choice. You buy a home because you want stability, because you want to customize your space, because you want to put down roots. Those are all valid reasons, but don't pretend it's some brilliant financial move. In most cases, renting and investing the difference is the smarter play if your goal is financial independence. The home is a hedge against rent increases and a forced savings mechanism, and that's valuable. But it's not the path to liquid wealth. Let me tell you about a guy named Ron, who I met through a business networking thing a few years ago. Ron's in his early 60s now, sold a small manufacturing business back in 2015 for about 1.8 million. Decent exit. But here's the thing. He'd spent the previous 20 years dumping every spare dollar into his business and into his house. By the time he sold, he owned a $900,000 house outright, and he had maybe $300,000 in retirement accounts. The 1.8 million from the sale, after taxes and fees, he netted about 1.2 million. So his total liquid net worth after the sale was 1.5 million. Sounds great, right? Except he'd been living a lifestyle that cost him $120,000 a year. Nice cars, vacations, private school for his kids when they were younger, and he couldn't dial it back. So that 1.5 million, even invested well, was generating maybe 60 to 70,000 a year. He needed another 50,000 annually just to maintain his lifestyle. He ended up having to take a consulting gig. He's still working. And the kicker is he owns this massive house that costs him 40 grand a year just in taxes, insurance, and upkeep. He's got nearly $900,000 of net worth locked in a structure that he has to feed. If he'd sold the house, downsized, and freed up $600,000 to invest, he'd be generating another $24,000 a year in passive income. He'd be fine, but he won't do it because the house is part of his identity now. That's the trap. Here's the uncomfortable truth about home equity. It's only useful in 3 scenarios. 1, you sell the house and downsize or start renting, freeing up the cash. 2, you take out a home equity loan or line of credit, which means you're borrowing against it and taking on debt. Or 3, you do a reverse mortgage when you're old, which is basically selling your house back to a bank slowly. None of those options are appealing to most people. So what ends up happening is they just sit on this massive pile of illiquid wealth, feeling rich on paper, but struggling with cash flow. And when they finally do sell, usually because they're downsizing in retirement, the market might be down, or they realize that after real estate commissions and moving costs and everything else, they're not actually unlocking as much cash as they thought. The data backs this up. According to research from the Federal Reserve, the median net worth for a household in the 55 to 64 age range is about $200,000. But here's the thing. The median home equity for that same group is $150,000. That means the median household approaching retirement has only about $50,000 in non-home wealth. $50,000. That's it. That's not enough to retire on. Not even close. These people are going to be entirely dependent on Social Security and maybe a small pension if they're lucky. They're millionaires in name only if you squint and include the house. But in terms of actual financial independence, they're nowhere close. Now, here's where this gets darker. The real estate market in the United States has been on an absolute tear since the 2008 financial crisis. Home prices have more than doubled in most markets. So you've got millions of people who bought homes in the 2010s and are now sitting on massive equity gains. A house they bought for $300,000 in 2012 is worth $600,000 now. They feel wealthy, but they haven't actually realized any of that gain unless they sell. And if they sell, they have to buy another house, which is also inflated, or start renting. So that wealth is theoretical. It only exists if they're willing to downsize or relocate to a cheaper market. And most people won't do that. They're psychologically anchored to their home. So you end up with this weird situation where millions of Americans are house-rich millionaires on paper, but functionally middle class in terms of their actual spending power. They're still working, still stressed, still one major expense away from financial trouble. The incentive structure here is fascinating too. The entire financial industry, all the banks and mortgage lenders and real estate agents, they have every reason to push homeownership. Because a mortgage is a 30-year annuity for the bank. They make a fortune on interest. And real estate agents make 6% commission on every sale. Nobody makes money when you rent and invest the difference. So the cultural narrative is that owning a home is the pinnacle of financial success. It's the American dream. And for a lot of people, it works out great. But for a huge percentage of the population, it's the thing that keeps them from ever achieving real financial independence, because all their wealth ends up locked in an illiquid asset that doesn't produce income. There's also this psychological phenomenon where people conflate their home's value with their personal success. Your house goes up by $50,000 in a year, and you feel like you earned $50,000, but you didn't. You just happened to own an asset that appreciated. You didn't create that value. The market did. And that appreciation is meaningless unless you sell. But people feel richer, so they spend more. They take out home equity loans to buy new cars or renovate the kitchen. They're borrowing against unrealized gains, which is insane when you think about it. And then the market corrects, like it did in 2008, and suddenly they're underwater on a loan they took out to buy a boat. That's not wealth. That's leverage masquerading as wealth. So let's come back to the original question. How many people are actually millionaires in a way that matters? Not 7% of the population, not even close. It's more like 2%. And even within that 2%, a lot of those people have their wealth tied up in retirement accounts they can't touch without penalty until they're 60. So the number of people who are genuinely financially free, who have liquid assets they can deploy right now to live off indefinitely, it's probably closer to 1%, maybe even less. That's the reality. The rest are just people who got lucky with real estate timing, or who spent 30 years paying off a mortgage, and now they feel successful because the number on Zillow is big, but they're still working. They're still stressed. They're not free. Here's what you actually need to do if you want to be in that top 1 or 2%. First, stop optimizing for net worth and start optimizing for passive income. Every financial decision you make should be filtered through this question. Does this increase the amount of money I can generate without working? If the answer is no, be very skeptical. Buying a bigger house doesn't increase your passive income. It decreases it because now you have higher expenses. Maxing out your 401k and investing in index funds, that increases your passive income. It's that simple. Second, treat your home as a lifestyle expense, not an investment. If you want to buy a house because you want stability or you want to customize your space, fine. But don't fool yourself into thinking it's a wealth building strategy. The wealth is being built in your investment accounts, not in your walls. And third, focus on the gap between what you earn and what you spend, and widen that gap as much as possible. The bigger the gap, the more you can invest, and the faster you get to financial independence. Every dollar you save is a dollar that can start working for you. Every dollar you spend on lifestyle inflation is a dollar that's gone forever. Lazy investing built more fortune than crypto memes. Just consistent, boring, unglamorous index fund contributions for decades. That's the playbook. Not trying to time the market. Not buying the hot stock. Not speculating on real estate. Just putting 15 or 20% of your income into a diversified portfolio and ignoring it for 30 years. That's how you become an actual millionaire. Not the kind who has to tell everyone at parties. The kind who doesn't have to work. The people who figured this out early, they're the ones retiring at 50. The people who bought into the homeownership narrative and sunk all their wealth into their primary residence, they're working until 65 and hoping Social Security doesn't get cut. Same starting point, different decisions, completely different outcomes. And the gap between those two outcomes is only getting wider.